The Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar. Who controls the minerals of the future? Central Asia, India and the new supply chain battle. As the world transitions to renewable energy and new digital technologies, the demand for critical minerals and rare earth elements has spiraled. The need for these resources in green infrastructure, battery production and electronics means their supply chains are economically and geopolitically crucial. So who will control these vital minerals going forward? With the battle intensifying and Central Asia and India emerging as pivotal players, what role will other global powers such as China play? To learn more about this timely issue, tune into our live debate, bringing your comments and questions for our expert panel.
Hello and welcome. I am your host, Humphrey Hawksley, for this Democracy Forum debate on who controls the minerals of the future, Central Asia, India, and the new supply chain battle. The Democracy Forum has won a reputation for examining issues often overlooked by mainstream media and commentariat, which this one was when we planned it several months ago. But now, with Venezuela and Greenland, China, of course, this question of critical minerals has been catapulted to the centerpiece of global politics, like securing supply chains in oil, food, water, and now it's the minerals. What are they exactly? Where are they? Who needs them? Why? And where does Central Asia and India fit in? And what are the stakes? To find out, we have a brilliant Democracy Forum panel: Isabel McRae, Guy Kioni, Karthik Bansal, and Dhanasree Jayaram. And with us throughout is Barry Gardner, MP, chair of the Democracy Forum, who will sum up what we've learned and may challenge our arguments. And before all that, I have the privilege of asking Democracy Forum President, Lord Charles Bruce, to lay out the background and the canvas of our discussion. Lord Bruce, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon and welcome to the first Democracy Forum webinar of 2026. We wish you all a very happy new year. Today, we will be investigating the disruption of the global trade in critical minerals, which is rapidly becoming weaponized with huge consequences for the world economy. I'm very grateful to the team at the Democracy Forum for highlighting this topic and for assembling such an erudite panel of experts to share their insights with us. I thank them all for taking part, and I thank Humphrey Hawksley for taking the role of moderator. It was with remarkable foresight that Deng Xiaoping boasted in 1987 that although the Middle East has the oil, China has the rare earths, a global supply chain that China now clearly dominates, with 69% of mining output and over 90% of refining capacity. As the Financial Times comments, Beijing has cemented its position as the lowest cost producer at every stage of the rare earth value chain, thanks to decades of state planning and strategic acquisition. Indeed, Beijing is now actively leveraging the competitive advantage which it has painstakingly built up over 40 years, imposing sweeping and strict export controls last October, expanding an extensive list of restrictions and conditions to 5 additional rare earths on top of 7 it identified last April, thus covering most of the recognized rare earth elements required in technologically advanced and strategic important manufacturing processes. So it's now indisputable that a battle to control the supply chain of critical minerals has broken out, where I quote, structural competition between the United States and China has opened a fault line that no summit or deal can easily mend. And observing the meeting between Presidents Trump and President Xi in South Korea at the end of October, where China agreed a 12-month moratorium on the export controls previously announced, analysts emphasize the strategic chokehold which China now possesses, where I quote, President Xi stared down President Trump and Trump blinked. She has mastered managing Trump. Meeting United States threats with larger threats has gotten Washington to back down, and seeking alternative routes to secure a long-term and reliable supply of rare earths and thereby stabilize the supply chain. In early November, the United States celebrated the 10th anniversary of the C5+1 partnership, an agreement with 5 Central Asian countries: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyz Republic, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, which it entered in 2015. Elevating to a critical minerals dialogue in 2024, the partnership is now pursuing specific rare earth mining and processing agreements with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Confronting similar vulnerabilities as the United States, the Indian government in June slapped a prohibition on exports to Japan of rare earths primarily used in manufacturing magnets for electric vehicles. India has launched a national critical minerals mission, which envisages the realization of 1,200 domestic exploration prospects by 2031 to achieve self-sufficiency in at least 5 key rare earth elements. Although it holds the world's 3rd largest reserve of rare earth elements, it contributes less than 1% of relevant mining output. And as the economist Daniel Yergin concludes, I quote, "The old thinking about what I call easy globalization is increasingly out of the door. Countries and governments, including the United States, are focusing much more on resilience, vulnerability, and control." Well, thank you very much for deciding to watch our webinar today. And if you have any questions or queries for the panel, please pass them through the chat.
Thank you, Lord Bruce. What a fascinating quote from Deng Xiaoping 40 years ago. That is foresight for you. Our first speaker is Isabel McRae, founder of IM Consulting, dealing with Central Asia and the South Caucasus. She also works with strategic simulations at Cambridge University's Centre for Geopolitics and is associated with numerous organizations such as the Munich Security Conference, NATO, and others. So what are these critical minerals and how do they feed into today's geopolitics? Start us off, Isabel McRae. Give us context.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Humphrey. It's great to be here. So these critical minerals are, of course, the raw materials that we need to power our economy, technology, defense, really any kind of future-looking green energy and digital technology. But what I want to talk about today is really how Central Asia plays into this. Given that I work on Eurasian economic connectivity, this seems like a good place to start. And I want to talk about some of the larger geopolitical dynamics we see and trends within the region and also with external actors. So first, let's talk about Russia, actually, because what I think is really interesting is that at the start of the Russia's invasion in Ukraine and the war with Ukraine, Russia's stronghold on Central Asia and the C5 states was loosened a bit. And this gave way to a new era, I would say, of inter-regional cooperation, where Central Asian states started working together both on a new way in their economy, in their security, and in their dealings with other international interests beyond just Russia. This is not to say that Russia does not maintain strong interest in the region. They're interested in keeping the political alignment, and they have ongoing investments, but the interest, let's say, has waned and given way to China, to United States, to the EU to come in as new parties, especially in the area of critical minerals and rare earth materials. And so part of that is this development of the Middle Corridor. You may have heard of this term. And this is essentially a transport link many transport links, rail, infrastructure, pipelines that would span from China across Central Asia, across the Caspian. Turkmenistan is part of that sometimes, as well as the South Caucasus, Turkey, and then onwards to Europe, the Middle East. And so this is also connected to Europe's own interest in diversifying their energy resources through the Southern Gas Corridor, where it now receives a significant portion of its crude oil from Kazakhstan across the Caspian. But we also see the development of initiatives like TRIP between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the Trump Route for International Peace and Prosperity, as part of this larger interest to bring resources through Central Asia and out into the larger international sphere. We've also seen the development of the Southern Corridor, which is essentially through Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and then Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, such as through the Tapi pipeline from Turkmenistan's oil fields and the Trans-Afghan Railway. So we're looking at development through the south side, opening up new connections that were formerly took a month to deliver, that could now look at shipping within days. And so against this backdrop, let's talk about the EU for starters. The EU, of course, has an interest in diversifying its energy supplies in oil and gas away from Russia, but is also really interested in securing material that's going to be vital for electric vehicle batteries, for clean energy technology. And so we've seen a huge amount of activity in the past year, really, with the first EU summit in Central Asia, in Samarkand in April, billions of euros of deals in green energy, the development of the largest rare earth deposit in Kazakhstan, uranium deals in Uzbekistan. And so the EU is, of course, looking at this economic diplomacy as a way to secure its future away from China, away from Russia, and by building these long-term partnerships with Central Asian states. The US, on the other hand, I think has, of course, similar interests, but because of its location, of course, it's interested more in diversifying away from its reliance on China and building this economic security. And so we've seen also, as Lord Bruce mentioned, a huge amount of activity and deals with US companies in the exploration and development of critical minerals like tungsten in the past year. And that was really highlighted recently in November during the Washington C5+1 summit, in how those new partnerships with Central Asian states really aligns with the Trump administration's agenda on securing resources for the US economy going forward and the national security through this kind of very win-win types of deals with external partners. And so we can say that these Western partnerships are desirable in that there's often an interest in long-term supply chain development and building infrastructure that is really needed in Central Asia because it is less developed. However, Western partners are not the only ones. We see, of course, China has huge investments in renewable energy, in mining, but we also see GCC countries entering the game now, and a number of partnerships with other states like Japan, Turkey, Azerbaijan. But overall, I think what's really interesting is that while there is this power play going on, we see this new level of regional cooperation, this really unprecedented between the Central Asian states. They were not always a happy family, but I think we're in a new era of this kind of coordination on this level. And so that's with border delimitation, with resource sharing like water, and I think bodes well in terms of strengthening their own economies in the coming future.
Isabel, thank you for that. Can I just clarify the critical mineral element of in this new cooperation that you talked about? How important is the critical mineral element in that cooperation? Is it a catalyst? Is it one factor? Is it the driver?
I would say that it's more of a catalyst. I would not say it is the only factor, because we're seeing cooperation on a number of other levels, and energy is one of them, not only critical mineral exploration, but I think there's an awareness that going forward, it will become increasingly critical, increasingly important.
Is this area that, that you vividly describe as getting loosened up from the Russian bear, as it were? Is this now a sort of rivals playing field for this? Is the EU competing against China, competing against Russia? Or, as Philip Bowman says, one of our audience in this question, how will the world's nations manage to balance resource nationalism with global cooperation? Could you feed that question into your answer there?
Yes, that's a good one. Certainly there is a level of competition. I mean, if you look at the tenders that are going out, for example, who's doing what? I mean, we had Kazakhstan was putting out tenders for the development of nuclear energy plants, and Rosatom was the first winner, and then Chinese companies took the next two plants. And so this is very interesting, right? If you're looking at all of these players, but I would say that they all come with different perceptions, right? The Americans are a certain kind of partner. Europeans, they're valuing more long-term investment. They're also putting additional financing into social and economic development in a way that the Chinese companies are not. And so I think there's a lot of considerations on the local level about who they want to partner with and when.
That's brilliant. Stay with us because we will come back to you. And our next speaker now is Dr. Guy Kioni from the Critical Minerals Initiative. He's a Critical Minerals Initiative Fellow at the Cambridge Middle East and North Africa Forum and Chief Executive of Missang, which is a geostrategy and management consultancy firm. Much of his expertise lies in the Congo, which is known for its conflict minerals. Are critical and conflict minerals the same thing, or are critical minerals going to become conflict minerals? And how does all that connect to India and Central Asia? Guy Kioni, join the dots for us.
Thank you very much, Humphrey, for the question and for setting up this discussion. Critical mineral and conflict mineral are not necessarily the same thing. One of the reasons why we talk about conflict minerals is the way those minerals are being extracted. You know, in countries like DRC, Zambia, for instance, there's a lot of artisanal mining whereby women, kids are extracting the minerals such as cobalt or copper with their bare hands. And that's where the conflict mineral comes into, because some of the region, particularly in the eastern part of the DRC, there are conflicts that are fueling those activities. When you look at a region such as the Central Asian countries, often called the C5, they also have artisanal mining operations, although at a much smaller case. So this to say that conflict mineral and critical mineral are not necessarily the same, although they overlap. But talking about, or something I'd like to talk about, is the strategic positioning of the C5 countries. You know, C5 countries sit at the intersection between Europe and Asia. They are land bridge. That land bridge, because they were landlocked, used to be, I'd say, a disadvantage. But with the huge reserve that the C5 country have, over 43 trillions worth of critical mineral and rare earth reserves, it makes that region very strategic. As Isabel just described, with the Russian power diminishing and the attention in the region diminishing, the Chinese are taking over by investing a lot of money in infrastructure around, transport, energy, because holding the minerals is one thing, but with that energy, with that export control, export capability, with that trade route, with that corridor, with that skill development, those minerals are worthless. And that's where the different powers are fighting, whether it's the EU, the Russia, or China, or India, are vying to get a pie of what the C5 country have. So to me, if I have to answer the question, who controls the minerals of the future, in the context of the C5, I'd say it will be a regional, relational control between India, who's investing a lot into a corridor there. You've got the US investing into local processing capability. The Chinese are already there and they're trying to assert themselves. But really what the C5 countries are trying to do, and that's what I would like us to remember, is the optionality. Is the option to work with the Chinese, the US, and the EU, which is what African countries are trying to do as well. Africa, as you know, the Chinese, the Chinese are really well advanced into the mining sector. In the DRC, for instance, most of the mines are owned by the Chinese, or at least have Chinese interests, and that's what the C5 countries are trying to avoid. Now, there are a couple of tools, I'd say, that the C5 countries can leverage. So we talked about the infrastructure development, and as Isabel mentioned just before me, usually the C5 countries were competing a lot, but now we can see a growing collaboration, because without that collaboration between those 5 countries, I think they will miss the opportunity to succeed. One of the major issues we see in the C5 countries is that the mining operations requires a lot of water, and water is something that region doesn't really have. So that's where the US is putting together some framework to do some technological transfer in terms of seed planting, to make sure that they're able to capture enough water to be able to do what they can do in terms of processing their water capability. Secondly, in terms of the processing and refining capability, we see that in the DRC, for instance, whereby their initiative aimed at refining and processing the critical minerals inside the country, because then it gives them the leverage, it gives them the skill that remains in country, and they can therefore capture the values. What the C5 countries wants to do is exactly the same thing, because right now, most of the refining and processing capabilities are in China. The C5 countries are emerging to become one of the top reserve of rare earth after China. And if that proves to be the case, the refining and the processing will not be done in China. The ambition is to be done inside the C5, and India, as well as the US and the EU, are injecting a lot of money to make sure that they are able to capture that value. So again, to conclude, I'd say control will be led by who control the processing and refining capability, who control the trade routes, who control the energy flow. But in the case, particularly of the C5, who controls the water technology and the water disbursement to make sure that the mining operations works. So in a nutshell, that's what I think makes the C5 country very strategic at the moment.
That is absolutely fascinating. Could I just encapsulate for our audience the way I understand it? China controls 90% of the processing of these minerals. Yes. Is there a geographical area in the world where these minerals are predominant? Because I understand they are everywhere. It's just a matter of where you get them out of the ground, and that's expensive. Could you?
Yes, I mean, as you said, they are all over the world, but in China is really compressed. China actually holds 60% of the world reserve.
Oh, China has 60% of the resources. And how much does Central Asia have?
We don't know exactly because the mapping is still ongoing, but it's emerging to become potentially the next destination after China. And that makes sense because geographically they are next to one another.
Okay, but they're way behind China as far as research and exploration and all that. A question from Ritesh Nigam, which you talked to because you were talking about the minerals are worthless if you can't get them around. Ritesh says, who really controls the value of the critical minerals, the value of these minerals?
That's a very good question, and I'm going to answer that by giving you an example from the DRC, for instance. DRC is one of the top producers of cobalt. 70% reserve in the DRC. Most of the production goes to China, who then controls the stockpile, the production, and then they can control the price. What the DRC did, they did an export ban on the cobalt to stop the stockpiling by a foreign entity, which then increased the price of the cobalt. So we'll see the mineral-rich countries using such tool to increase the value and control the value of the minerals.
Okay, that is fascinating. And also you were talking about processing within the country, but there's been some problems with other raw materials on that, is that with EU tariffs and that sort of thing, is that then that becomes sort of problematic. Will that be something that can be fixed?
that's something that can definitely be fixed, because when you look at most of the mineral-rich countries pushing for processing and refining capability, what we need to recognize is that that technology doesn't sit in mineral-rich country. Whether it's DRC, Zambia, or the G5 country, they don't have the technology. So the mineral deal framework that we see across the world right now is that they come with off-taking agreements. In the case of DRC, off-taking agreement by the DoD, for instance, which means that the technology comes in with an off-taking link to it, and that's resolved that issue.
Yeah, this is absolutely fascinating. Stay with us, Guy, and we come to our next speaker in just a second after this very short break. Thank you and welcome back. Our third speaker in this fascinating debate is Karthik Bansal. We're now going to Delhi or to India for our next two speakers. Karthik Bansal is a research associate in the Minerals and Mining Program at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, which examines the big issues facing India and the world. And one of his specialities is India's critical mineral supply chains. He's written widely on how the global push against climate change does rely on technologies using critical minerals, and has examined how India, China, and other Asian countries are dealing with this challenge. So Karthik Bansal, tell us what you know.
Hi, thank you. In terms of how India is, so in my brief talk, what I'm going to focus on is try to tell you more about how India is sort of responding to it. We remember Bruce also mentioning that India's critical mineral mission is come up and what India is doing there, and also what some of the other countries in Asia are doing in terms of looking at the critical mineral supply chains and the challenges that they face, and draw some of the parallels there. So firstly, in terms of India, we see that the largest scope that India is pushing for is the critical minerals mission. And it's globally now known that India has put up close to 1.9 billion USD, and which is one of the largest investments in the critical mineral space in India coming from the government. And the expected investment is going to be up to 2 billion USD under this project. The critical minerals mission, however, faces specific challenges within the Indian policy system in itself. Whether it is to look at that India is one of the only countries that has mineral auction policies, which is that you're allocated minerals to mine in India based on an auction mechanism wherein the highest bidder ends up getting the allotted lease and you mine based on that. The challenge that we're facing in India is that we are seeing exorbitantly high bids. That means a very high bidder, which quotes up to 750%, says that 750% of the profit is what I'm going to give back to the government in terms of an auction premium, which we think is unsustainable and is highly unlikely that will be possible or economically feasible for companies to do so. So therefore, we are seeing that there is a slow progress in the manner in which Indian critical mineral space would grow on the mining front. However, we do think that there is a larger, better potential in critical minerals processing and mineral recycling, which is where we think that the capacity in India is growing. There are a few concerns, though, that any country that is looking towards thinking about building up its processing capacity might have to think. One, where is the mineral coming from? And second is if the processing is going to be cost competitive compared to other countries that are currently supplying a lot of these minerals at a low cost. For instance, India's response to a lot of the rare earth mineral ban coming from China is that it ended up, securing its rare earth mineral supply by not exporting a lot of its rare earths to Japan, but also putting up a production link incentive for manufacturers to start thinking about manufacturing permanent magnets in India coming from rare earths. Now, there are a few concerns there. One is that in India, there is no current potential to process rare earth at a large scale. So you're still dependent on first building that technology and then putting that technology into use about creating permanent magnets. So what is strategic for countries to do when they're thinking about building processing capacity is global partnerships, is partnerships with countries that already either have had a lot more experience in processing these minerals or already are looking for places wherein there are more resources available in that country and processing hubs can be placed there. Rare earth is one such mineral that India has a lot of capacity for and can set up processing capabilities, right? And this is where we think few countries become important, and the policies these countries have put forth in the Asian region become very important. Japan, Indonesia, Myanmar. Japan becomes relevant for India and for a lot of Asian countries because Japan invested heavily in the United States when there were benefits under the IRA that a lot of them were seeking. But there are a few challenges that they're facing now. The current Trump regime has de-invested away from the IRA, and a lot of these companies are not likely to get the kind of benefit that they were promised under the IRA. So therefore, Japan is looking for partnering more and more in the critical mineral space, and India has had a history of partnering with Japan in the rare earth supply chain. So what India needs to also look at is the complete supply chain and try to go ahead and focus on building these partnerships with countries that have had experience of a similar nature. Similarly, when we think about why Japan becomes relevant in India, it's also because we think Japanese investors have had experience in terms of building technologies as well and not just processing. And then there is a great demand for moving the processing capacity to therefore manufacturing technology and moving forward. The concern that you do see is what countries like Indonesia face. That is to say that Indonesia, which ended up having a spurt of supply of nickel, now is facing a lot of concerns because of the oversupply and the cost competitiveness of sustaining that oversupply, right? So it is now in a place wherein it is not able to make as much money as it had wished in terms of how much it is oversupplying nickel. The current use of nickel then for countries like India will improve moving forward, and securing supply from countries like Indonesia will be advantageous. Indonesia's current response to this, however, is that Indonesia is becoming more and more open to signing partnerships with a lot of other global economies. Right? India needs to leverage on that, and a lot more Asian partnership needs to strengthen in terms of leveraging the capacity other Asian countries have in terms of supplying these minerals to you. And Indonesia is a great example for what countries should prioritize moving forward. But there are also other countries within Asia which are important to look at and study. For example, Myanmar. And the reason why Myanmar becomes important is because Myanmar has large resources of rare earths, but almost all of it is supplied to China. Some of it, even unreported, unregulated, moves to China. Right? Now, this country is also there are also various concerns that are lifted with regard to Myanmar in terms of that the region faces a lot of conflicts. So that means a lot of the mineral coming out of this region is considered conflict mineral, as the previous speaker was highlighting, and these resources are then a concern in terms of are they secure to be supplied to other countries. So therefore, many countries do not openly come forward and try to tie up with Myanmar or partner with Myanmar as easily to export a lot of these minerals coming from Myanmar. But China does not care about that. China is okay with going ahead and securing these kinds of supplies and leveraging on cheap, low-cost supply coming from conflict regions as well. So therefore, it is important to also for countries to see the manner in which conflict regions do supply minerals and the kind of minerals that exist in conflict regions and how countries like China are taking advantage of these situations. Moving forward, though, if we want to answer the bigger question of who controls the minerals of the future, we think that the control of the mineral currently, while seems to be in China, what countries can do is have more strategic responses to the manner in which the supply chain looks. We don't think that the answer to critical minerals supply chain concerns is only pushing on domestic mining, but to think about the entire value chain building in your country. We don't think any country can actually expertise in all mineral capacity. We think countries need to strategically think what mineral can they prioritize, what mineral do they have access to, and what mineral can they build a lot of expertise in. And only then will countries have a more strategic and a more thematic response to the manner in which they move forward. Yeah.
Karthik, thank you very much for that. The title of our debate, Central Asia, India, and the New Supply Chain Battle, the way you outlined where India is with this, it seems that it's not even fighting a battle at the moment. It's way behind. Have I misread that?
I would tend to agree that India is actually not fighting the battle, in terms that a lot of the responses that are coming in India right now are a bit delayed, in the sense that the envisioning of some of the policies that India has domestically directly conflate with the goal that it wants to in the long term. For instance,
Sorry, so I mean, India likes to see itself as a leader of the global South, and all of that. But is this not an issue that it or some global South nation should be leading in order to stop this superpower conflict?
I agree, but for doing that, I think what a lot of the global South countries need to also realign then is to wonder what is really a critical mineral strategy that you need to follow. If your critical mineral strategy is going to be that we're going to explore more, mine more, and prioritize that over building partnerships, then a lot of the focus becomes domestic rather than leveraging on what your nearby suppliers has to do. And that's what we think is happening in India a lot more strongly.
Okay. So do you think this is going to move in the next year or so as far as government policy and priorities go, or do you think it is going to continue as it is?
We think that from what we can see in the Indian landscape, we think that the global partnership that are stepping into India will pick up moving forward, but it is the Indian businesses that are actually doing a lot of work, and we can talk more about that as to how the recycling space in India is actually growing. And we think the more potential is there, and it's the economy that will respond to this demand, rather than we think the policy shifts will take way longer, and the next few years is unlikely.
I just want to put a question for a very quick answer, because we have touched on it by Anil Batra. Can Central Asian countries, and let's include India in this, move from just exporting raw minerals to developing their own processing and manufacturing capabilities? Are we talking about years, decades, in order to set up this infrastructure?
We think these countries definitely have the potential to be processing more than they are doing right now. But what matters is these countries to say, these are the only minerals that we will focus on, and not focus on way too many mineral baskets, right? And we think that matters more.
How many mineral baskets are there? In
India, we are focusing on 33 minerals at this point, to which many of them are not even present in India, domestic resources. So we think we need to ask ourselves, if we're going to focus on processing, do we have the domestic resources? If we don't, then where will we get it from? Therefore, pick the minerals and then choose your battle.
Karthik, thank you very much for that. Please stay with us, because we will come back to you. And our final panelist is Dhanasree Jayaram from the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations at the Manipal Academy of Higher Education, and also connected to the Center of Climate Politics and Security at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. So we have a global stretch there. Her research focuses on global environment politics, including security, military, climate policy, and diplomacy. So who controls the minerals of the future? Central Asia, India, and the new supply chain battle. What are these north-south dynamics? Dhanasree Jayaram, give us your insight.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I'll just draw upon a lot of what has been said, but in terms of how this connects, especially in terms of the socio-environmental implications of mining, who's really designing the sustainability standards, who's implementing them. Because I think when we talk about these, the critical minerals and who's really controlling them, and who has the technology, and who's really controlling the upstream and the downstream processes. I think in all of this involves sustainability, and I think this is where it's not just about energy transition minerals, but also in terms of extractive industries and the experience of the world in dealing with extractive industry is something that has to be learned as well. So, I mean, I think over the past few years, there's been a lot of work that has happened in terms of understanding and assessing the kind of damage that extractive industries, especially critical mineral industries, can and and have already sort of done, apart from the conflict minerals that was already touched upon. Whether it is about land degradation and biodiversity loss, because we have seen cases of how this has caused deforestation, soil erosion, destruction of habitats, etc. There's, of course, the water concern, which is something that was also talked about earlier, and how this could also have ripple effects on the agricultural sector, communities, and even other sectors that are highly dependent on water sources. The toxic health risks is something that is obviously also talked about, and I think lastly there is also the issue of social risks of particularly community displacement, and how some of these large scale projects particularly could affect indigenous communities and threaten even traditional livelihoods. Now, this is where I think where the global south, global north dynamics also sort of play out, because much of these dynamics are seen more in the global south, where the upstream really lies. So yes, there is a sort of a resource dependency, where the global south countries are mostly currently known for supplying the critical minerals, but they don't have much of a bargaining power when it comes to particularly the global value chains, as was also pointed out in one of the earlier interventions about how the value of critical minerals is decided and what role does global south have in this, and global south countries, particularly the upstream countries, have in this. And that is a question that needs to be addressed. There is, of course, a big question mark over how critical minerals is being projected as a climate solution, because this is obviously part of the energy transition story. But again, it has this disproportionate effects on the ecosystems and communities of the global south. And this is where, again, there is a sort of a power asymmetry that is being seen. I think, Karthik particularly touched upon this issue of the gap that exists in terms of technology and knowledge. And I think this is where the high-end processing, high-tech sort of technologies, who really possesses them. And again, the southern actors are just getting, and producers are, that have mostly focused on the lower value sort of sectors, are now slowly getting into this idea of trying to also invest in processing and other technologies that are equally important in trying to understand who really controls this sector. So yeah, and I think in a way, this is also something very important to consider in terms of the value chain, is to, particularly global south countries that have for long also experienced debt and so many other issues. How does this affect economies and communities at the local level? And so these are some of the aspects that are which also sort of directly link with the issues of equity and justice, particularly because we are talking in climate diplomacy, for instance, we are talking about just transitions, and now when you talk about just transitions, and it's not just transitions in terms of the energy sector, but it's a more holistic sustainability transitions that we are talking about. And if we are to learn from what we have seen in the climate debate or sustainability debate over a period of time, we also have to understand what is, for instance, the environmental and social safeguards that exist. What, is there an equitable access to resources that communities have? What is the role of the local governments? Because there are countries where it's very centralized, while in other countries where the local governments, like in countries of Latin America, for instance, the Lithium Triangle particularly has seen some of these indigenous groups and local governments really come up in arms against the ecosystem degradation caused by the lithium mining. So that has really led to changes within the system and within the societies as well, to a large extent. Now, this is where I just want to also briefly touch upon what can Global South do, and this question was also raised by Humphrey previously, and particularly because India is also looking at, for instance, cooperating with Central Asian countries. So it's also looking outward. It's as much as but it's of course its focus is more inward, but then there is an outward sort of focus, particularly looking at signing up agreements with countries that have these resources. So yeah, South-South cooperation, we are talking a lot about it, but of course, this is very early stages to say whether India could lead this sort of cooperative arrangements, just like it has done, say, with solar energy or biofuels alliance, for instance. Is there a way of trying to create that sort of a network of global South countries coming together to leverage this sector? I think it's also important to look at, for instance, how, you need to have these global governance reforms, whether it is trying, because we're increasingly seeing, for instance, climate and trade frameworks are being linked with each other, like the European framework of carbon border adjustment mechanism is one such example. Just energy transition partnership that G7 countries are signing with developing countries is another example. So how do we embed equity principles, in these sort of big frameworks is something very important to carry forward to also the critical minerals strategies that these countries are coming up with. Central Asia, I don't want to talk too much about it, but we know that there's been a lot of mining that has happened in these countries, not necessarily just critical minerals, but also like Kazakhstan, which has seen rare earth extraction and uranium extraction, and has seen like water scarcity and similar issues in the past. So learning from these examples is very important to create the sort of participatory mechanisms that is, I think, very relevant in particularly global South countries, which can work towards more inclusive and more more community-centric approaches to critical mineral extraction, as well as other sort of technological interventions that are needed to leverage these resources. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. So India and Central Asia are beginning to get one voice on this issue. They're beginning to get agreements.
It's hardly a few months since the first, expression of interest has been made, and there is, of course, some, at least there's some level of interest that is shown, but we have to wait and see how this will be leveraged, because there are some that has taken off quite well, but there are others which will take time, because this also means there has to be like institutional reforms within India, exactly. And that is also you have to happening at a very slow pace.
Very, very slow pace. I want to ask you a question, then go back to the panel to sort of tease this idea out more. Prashant Kumar says, can these nascent geopolitical conflicts over minerals be compared to past oil crises, and how might Central Asia, India, and other global powers position themselves? You've answered it a touch, but give us one more line on that before we move back around the panel again.
Okay. Yeah. Yes and no, because we have like better technologies, and we have learned from previous mistakes. So if we don't follow the same patterns of extraction that has been followed, like particularly with oil industry, we saw how very lax regulations could lead to massive problems. So if there is if there are regulations which are friendly and to the communities, and it is participatory and also manages all these bureaucracies, then we can. But in terms of geopolitics, I think it's again dependent on the geographies of where these minerals are and how these partnerships are built, etc. So yeah,
exactly, because the Middle East oil and Venezuela we had just recently, that sort of thing. Yeah. Isabel McRae, your views, how might Central Asia, India, and other global powers position themselves? And is it like the oil thing? Is there going to be conflict like with oil on this?
It is a really interesting, perhaps scary question to think about in the long term. Right now in Central Asia, both things are going on, right? There's export of crude oil. It is a big part of the conversation in developing these transport networks and these rail and shipping networks that are also being used for critical minerals or for future processing and transport of critical minerals. So
in your sorry, no, but just in your sort of research and business, do you see Central Asia and India as a sort of unit when it comes to, or are they two separate entities?
I'm quite unfamiliar with the India side of things. It's been very illuminating listening to my
and you wouldn't be unfamiliar.
I don't immediately see them as connected, but what I think is very interesting is this kind of development right now of networks through Afghanistan, Pakistan to India that is starting to connect things up in new ways. And I know last year, I was running an event at Munich Security Conference on climate security and economic security in Central Asia. And our speaker from Uzbekistan brought up that growing relationship. So
that's interesting. That's an interest. Guy Kioni, are we looking towards conflicts as in the oil crisis? And I'd also like to throw in my own question there. Deng Xiaoping 40 years ago was forecasting this, or had the foresight to look into it. Was Africa or Asia, South Asia, actually saying, we've got to look at this? Or was it just not on the radar at all? Guy is muted.
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah,
yes.
We can. Off you go.
Can you just repeat the question quickly? Sorry.
Yeah, and it's just it's a question from Prashant Karma about whether there's going to be conflict over these critical minerals as there has been over oil. And I'm also interested in whether Africa was thinking, or South Asia was thinking like Deng Xiaoping was. They've got oil, we've got critical minerals. Was that a factor or not?
So it's a very good question. So I think what will happen, yes, definitely there's going to be some conflicts, but there's some initiative to try to preempt or prevent such a scenario. What you see in Southern African country, actually supported by the UK government, what they're doing, they're mapping out which minerals exist in which part of the different countries, and where does it make sense to have the refining capability in order to transform those minerals at a regional level. So if most region blocks do it in that way, I think it will reduce the friction, because there's no point having two refineries in Zambia, refinery in Namibia for the same minerals. We then look at what the different corridors can assist to transport minerals from one point to the other, and have a separate type of refinery as well.
That's fascinating. So you're thinking about the EU doing something, Organization of African States do something, Mercosur does something in Latin America, and those are the regional agreements.
It might end up going that way.
Okay, and that would avoid the conflicts. Karthik, Bansal, are we likely to have conflicts over these minerals?
The reason why the minerals sector is quite different from the oil sector is because there is a lot of complexity in the manner in which who owns the minerals versus who has the minerals, and which is what we're seeing in a lot of countries in, like, for example, the Congo example given by Kioni is also important, right? When in DRC, while the minerals exist in DRC, the largest investment in DRC is from Chinese companies, and these are joint investments with other regional companies. So it makes it harder for you to realize who is present in which country. So therefore, it's not as apparent, and therefore conflicts between countries are not going to be there. But what's important, though, is more countries realizing that they need to participate in mineral value chain and invest in a lot of these countries. And that is why European countries and Australian companies coming in to Africa is actually pushing countries to strengthen their regulation, say no to Chinese investments wherever it is, and even if they agree to Chinese investments, put better contracts in place, put better negotiating powers in place, and most importantly, they're okay with bringing technologies to Africa than taking minerals away from Africa. And we think that form of a change is what will avoid conflicts moving forward.
That is a very good point. It also answers Anad Tomar's question, which I haven't had time to put to you all, about how the Mineral Security Partnership and similar initiatives can hold up social standards, environmental standards in remote Central Asian mining operations. I think you talked to that a bit. Now, it is now time to go to the Democracy Forum chair, Barry Gardner, who's been gauging our debate. When Barry finishes, I want to come back to each of you just for a top line of what you take away or what we should take away from this debate. But Barry, how's our discussion going? Have we concluded anything?
Well, it's been fascinating. We had Charles kick us off with that quote from Deng 40 years ago about how they had the rare earths, and spoke about the indisputable battle that had broken out, and also said that China had a chokehold. He'd got to grips with she had got to grips with Trump and forced him to back down. Maybe that should prompt us to think, what are the minerals of the future? Because if you gauge by the US's recent actions in Venezuela and in Greenland, you might think that oil is still the mineral of the future. But maybe that has something to do with the chokehold that China has managed to exert, and the way in which she has got the better of Trump there. Interesting, the whole debate between extraction and production, and what Charles said about the lowest cost producer of rare earths now being in Beijing, and the restrictions that are then following from that to control supply, control cost. Isabel focused very much on the Central Asian states, and the way in which the Middle Corridor had loosened up from the relations with Russia through to China, and spoke about the way in which those countries, the C5, were now beginning to collaborate and cohere together in a way that previously they hadn't. I thought that was a very interesting point. But she also talked about the need of the EU for diversification of its energy supply away from Russian oil, and how the EU was now trying to build long-term partnerships using the infrastructure development that it could bring to countries in Central Asia. But of course, there, again, she pointed out competition with China, but perhaps I think she was suggesting that the EU might be a preferred partner in that relationship. Guy quite rightly distinguished critical and conflict minerals, an important sort of marker right at the beginning of his remarks, and again spoke about the C5 and the investment by China displacing Russia, and then talked about the Indian corridor to the C5, the growing collaboration again. I thought he made some really telling points when he talked about distinguishing between processing, trade routes, energy, and water as the elements that we need to have a strategy around. If you're going to have a strategy, it has to not simply be about how do we get our fingers on these things, who's getting it, once it's extracted. It is about all of those things, and I thought that was very, very well made points. And his example I liked as well when he talked about who controls the value, the DRC cobalt, 70%. Coming from DRC, but China, by using the power of processing and then stockpiling it, was then controlling the price. And so the retaliation, if you like, for that was when the DRC reduced supply to regain some sort of control there. Now, Karthik Bansal spoke about the critical minerals mission that India had launched, the $1.9 billion, and he spoke about the problems in the option systems for mining licenses, it resulting in high raw material costs. And in effect, I think he said that India really didn't have that processing capacity. So we're looking for partnerships with Japan, with Indonesia, Myanmar. I can see that you want me to move on swiftly. The question there, who will extract the value? He was saying India is delayed in securing critical minerals strategy. explore more, mine more, but basically at the moment, India seems to be operating much more on a domestic level rather than a geopolitical, geostrategic level. Dhanasree brought in the whole baggage that comes from the climate change negotiations following through from Kyoto and Paris and right up to date. Who is designing sustainability standards? This is not just about energy, it's about wider environmental and social safeguards. We have to understand the damage to the water supply, to soil degradation, and of course spoke very powerfully about the power imbalance between the global south and wealthier nations. How does it impact on local economies? How do we get a just transition? And said that India's main focus was inwards, but there was some small outward partnership agreements. But she said we need global governance reforms. How do we embed those principles in the control of the critical minerals sector? Well, what we've seen over the past month or so is the complete destruction, really, of what we thought was global governance and the rules-based order. And so if we're trying to bring back those sorts of reforms into this sector, I think we'll have a very tough job. And I thought that Prashant's question about, is this going to turn into a similar shakedown as we've seen with the oil industry? Everybody wanting the extraction, wanting the raw material, but then the processing and controlling of it, and the fights that go on internationally as a result. It seems that global trade is not getting any easier. We may be going towards a more renewable-based society, but we are going to keep with many of the same old problems.
Barry, thank you very much. We weren't trying to hurry you up. I think you went silent for a bit, and we got technically concerned about it. But thank you. That was a very, very good summing up for us. I just want a last thought, each of you, just 5 seconds each, your takeaway thoughts. Our title, Who Controls the Minerals of the Future? Central Asia, India, and the New Supply Chain Battle. Isabel McRae.
Yes. Well, for the final takeaway, I think some of my colleagues here have put it really well, that securing these supply chains in country first, if we're looking at Central Asia's own agency of sovereignty, is going to be the most important thing. So doing that in a way that supports the local economy, that supports sustainability, and strengthens its external partnerships will be the way to go.
Brilliant. In-country sustainability. Guy Kioni. You're muted again, Guy.
Yes. So whoever's going to control the critical mineral of the future is going to be a team sport. But the key that we need to remember is optionality. No one wants to tie their hands with a superpower. Optionality is the key.
Okay, that is similar to what Isabel was saying. Karthik, Bansal.
I would say be mineral specific in your strategy. Don't do too much at once, because that will allow control to lot others, and do not reinvent these technologies. Partner and get people to partner with you. Do not spend resources in reinventing technologies. That is not the way moving forward.
Excellent point. Dhanasree, Jayaram?
Yep, I think I'll just reiterate the point that we need to learn from the existing global governance mechanisms around issues that are, very important to understanding how extractive industries work. And basically, we need to learn from them and not replicate these hierarchies and power asymmetries and other kinds of, negative security implications that have, existed within these hierarchies. So, yeah.
I get in-country regional cooperation. Learn from others. Don't duplicate. Time's winged chariot now attacks, and we must end. Thank you, Isabel McRae, Guy Kioni, Karthik Bansal, and Dhanasree Jayaram for your forensic insight on what's going to become a very, very important issue. And thank you for all at the Democracy Forum for making this debate happen. Our next is on January the 28th, again at 2 p.m. or 1400 GMT London time. And the topic, the global implications of artificial intelligence deregulation. That's a fascinating one, and it impacts us all. Please join us then. So until January the 28th, stay safe and goodbye.
The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.